Recently, I had a really good discussion with a Protestant about Sola Scriptura, and he gave me the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is really important for Catholics to know and to know pretty well, because a lot of Protestants, obviously not all, but a lot of Protestants hold this as being binding and authoritative. And this is what it says about Sola Scriptura, and this is how Catholics can basically win the argument. I think this is pretty definitive, but they can basically win the argument against Protestants about Sola Scriptura. So this is what the Westminster Confession of Faith says. Quote, "The whole counsel of God concerning all things necessary for his own glory, man's salvation, faith, and life is either expressly set down in Scripture or by good and necessary consequence may be deduced from Scripture, unto which nothing at any time is to be added, whether by new revelations of the Spirit or traditions of men." Close quote. So basically what the Westminster Confession of Faith is saying here is saying everything that you need to get to heaven, all things necessary for salvation, everything you need to live well is contained in the Scriptures, either explicitly, like the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not commit adultery, do not lie, do not steal, etc. That's pretty explicit. So it's either set out explicitly or by a good and necessary consequence. And Protestants generally would say something like the Trinitarian doctrines are set out by good and necessary consequence. The word Trinity is not used in the Bible, but we can look and read and see how the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit interplay, and we can derive from a good and necessary consequence the doctrine of the Trinity. Now here's the thing, here's the twist, and if you get this, then you win, I think. Maybe Protestants watching this have a response to this that I haven't thought of. But I, as a Catholic, am confident, very confident, that I could lay out a biblical case that would persuade most people for the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption, purgatory, the intercession of the saints, the queenship of Mary. I can lay out a biblical case. I don't need the fathers. I don't need tradition. I don't even need the 7 deuterocanonical books that Protestants don't have in their Bible. I don't need any of that. From the 66-book canon that Protestants accept, I can prove, or at least make a strong biblical case for each and every one of those. And I would argue that those doctrines are contained in the Scriptures, not explicitly, but by a good and necessary consequence. For example, purgatory. Purgatory. Where do we get the idea of purgatory? Well, 1 John chapter 1, verse 8. St. John says, "If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us." Revelation chapter 21, verse 27, I think, talking about heaven. Jesus says, "Nothing unclean shall enter into heaven." So in this life, we know we all have impurities, uncleanness, sin, 1 John 1, 8. And in the next life, we don't have any. We don't have any impurities or any uncleanness whatsoever. So if somebody dies and they have these impurities and they're going to go to heaven, how do you get purified from point A to point B? How do you get from point A to point B, right? This is just a biblical case for purgatory. Obviously, it's simplified. That's not what this video is about. But I can make a biblical case for purgatory. I think purgatory is a good and necessary consequence of tradition, of the fathers, of something extra biblical? No, simply the Scriptures themselves. And there are many other Scriptures I could cite that support this point. But this is the crux, right? If you get this right, you win the argument. If a Protestant holds to this definition of Sola Scriptura or this explanation of Sola Scriptura, then you would say, okay, who gets to determine what is a good and necessary consequence of Scripture? Boom. Who gets to determine that? Because Baptists, the guy that I was talking to yesterday was a Baptist, do not believe in infant baptism. Lutherans do. Baptists will say, no, it's not a good and necessary consequence from the Scriptures to baptize babies. No, that's not right. Lutherans will say, no, it's a good and necessary consequence of the Scriptures to baptize babies. So who gets to decide? Or if you look at something like viewing filth on the internet, there's no verses that say that. So a lot of the people who I hear talking about this issue who are Protestants who don't have the magisterium behind them, they'll say, well, you shouldn't lust after women in your heart. We all know that. So filth on the internet is bad. And I heard somebody say this, and this is fascinating. Somebody said, well, what about if I'm not committing lust, I'm just committing the act of self-pleasing, right? And this Protestant pastor floundered. He had no idea. Because what do the scriptures say about that? What do they say? They don't really say anything. As Catholics, we know that's a mortal sin. That's objectively evil. That's contrary to God's plan and design for humanity, right? So that's just one example that came to the front of my mind where I was watching this Protestant pastor. I'm like, dude, no, you can't say that's okay. You can't affirm that. That is wicked. That is evil. That is a sin. Onanism is also a sin that Protestants have no way to answer. But that's the point. Who gets to determine what is a good and necessary consequence of Scripture and what is not? I say it's the Catholic Church. I also say that a good and necessary consequence of the Scriptures is the infallibility of the Pope, the infallibility of the Church, the episcopate. The existence of oral traditions is also a good and necessary consequence that comes from the Scriptures. So this is the point of the video. If somebody pulls out this declaration of faith, the Westminster Confession of Faith, if they pull this out and show it to you, I think as a Catholic, you can simply affirm that and say, yeah, I think that's true. And I think that the papacy, Matthew 16, is a good and necessary consequence of the Scriptures. And I think the existence of oral traditions, 2 Thessalonians 2:15, is a good and necessary consequence of the Scriptures, as well as the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going to say, no. And then you can start arguing from the Bible, and hopefully they realize that all of the Catholic dogmas, every single one of them, is 100% biblical. I can make a case for every single Catholic dogma. That's the way that it is.